The hot summer sun beat down mercilessly as I hauled the last shingle up the ladder, sweat dripping down my brow. I paused to wipe my forehead, surveying the progress I'd made on my roof repairs. As a licensed contractor, this was nothing new, just another day on the job. But little did I know, my hard work was about to land me in a world of trouble, all thanks to my nosy neighbor, Karen. It had all started a few weeks earlier when a nasty storm had ripped through the neighborhood, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. My roof had taken a beating, with shingles peeling off and water leaking through. I knew I had to act fast to prevent any further damage to my home. So, I got to work, ordering the necessary supplies and preparing to tackle the repairs myself. As I began the project, I couldn't help but notice Karen, my across-the-street neighbor, peering out her window, her beady eyes fixed on my every move. I tried to ignore her, focusing solely on the task at hand. But it was no use. That woman had a sixth sense for sniffing out any perceived wrongdoing, and she was determined to make my life a living hell. One afternoon, as I was nailing down the last of the shingles, I heard a loud commotion coming from the street. To my horror, I saw Karen storming towards me, her face flushed with outrage. "What do you think you're doing?" she screeched, her voice piercing my eardrums. I blinked in confusion. I'm just repairing my roof." "What's the problem?" "The problem," she spat, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "The problem is that you're up there, doing God knows what, and I've called the police to report your suspicious activity." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Suspicious activity. I exclaimed, "Karen, I'm a licensed contractor. I'm simply fixing my own roof, which is well within my rights." But Karen wasn't having it. "I don't care what kind of license you claim to have," she scoffed. "I know a criminal when I see one, and you, my friend, are up to no good." Before I could even respond, the sound of sirens filled the air, and 2 police officers came striding up the street, their faces etched with seriousness. "Sir, we've received a report of suspicious activity at this address," one of the officers said, his gaze fixed on me. "Would you mind coming down and answering a few questions?" I felt my heart sink as I realized the gravity of the situation. This was no longer just a case of a nosy neighbor. Karen had escalated things to a whole new level, and I was the one who was going to pay the price. As I carefully climbed down the ladder, my mind raced with a million thoughts. How had this happened? Why was Karen so hell-bent on sabotaging me? And most importantly, how was I going to convince the police that I was doing nothing wrong? One thing was certain. This was going to be a battle of wits and wills, and I was determined to come out on top. Karen had gone too far, and she was about to learn a hard lesson about the consequences of messing with a licensed professional. As the police officers approached me, their expressions neutral, I knew I had to think fast. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Karen had deliberately and maliciously reported me, and I couldn't let her get away with it. "Officers, I understand your concern, but I can assure you that there is nothing suspicious going on here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and level. "I am a licensed contractor, and I am simply repairing the damage to my own roof caused by the recent storm." The officers exchanged a glance, seeming skeptical. "Can you provide proof of your license, sir?" one of them asked. "Absolutely," I replied, quickly retrieving my wallet and pulling out my contractor's license. "Here you go. As you can see, I am fully licensed and insured to perform this kind of work." The officers examined the license closely, and I could see the tension in their shoulders start to ease. But before they could say anything, Karen interjected, her voice dripping with disdain. "That license is clearly forged," she spat, glaring at me with a mixture of contempt and triumph. "I know a con man when I see one, and this guy is trying to pull the wool over your eyes." I felt my blood boil at her accusation. "That's absurd, Karen," I snapped, "and you know it. I've been a licensed contractor in this community for over a decade, and you've never had a problem with my work before." The officers held up a hand, silencing us both. "Ma'am, we'll need to verify the authenticity of this license," one of them said, turning to Karen. "In the meantime, I'd ask that you refrain from making any further accusations without evidence." Karen's face flushed with indignation, but she reluctantly nodded, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. As the officers stepped away to make a call, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. This was a nightmare, pure and simple, and I had a sinking feeling that Karen was just getting started. Sure enough, a few minutes later, the officers returned, their expressions grim. "Sir, we've confirmed that your contractor's license is valid," one of them said, "but we've also received a report that you may have been involved in some shady business dealings in the past." I felt my heart drop. "What?" I exclaimed. "That's completely false. I've never been involved in any kind of illegal activity." The officers held up a hand. "Be that as it may, we're going to need to take you down to the station for further questioning," the other officer said, his voice authoritative. As they moved to handcuff me, I felt a wave of panic wash over me. This couldn't be happening. I was the victim here, not the criminal. And yet, somehow, Karen had managed to turn the tables on me, using her influence and her penchant for fabricating stories to make me the target of a police investigation. I knew then that this was going to be a fight for my very livelihood, and I was more determined than ever to come out on top. As the police officers led me to their squad car, I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. How had this situation spiraled so far out of control? I was an honest, hard-working contractor, simply trying to fix the damage to my own home, and yet here I was, being hauled off to the police station on the word of a vindictive and manipulative neighbor. As we drove through the streets, I couldn't help but glance out the window, catching a glimpse of Karen standing in her driveway, a smug expression on her face. I clenched my fists, my anger bubbling to the surface. This wasn't just about a roofing project gone wrong. It was about her twisted desire to see me taken down, to assert her dominance over the neighborhood. Once we arrived at the station, the officers ushered me into a small, sterile-looking interrogation room. They asked me a barrage of questions, digging into my past, scrutinizing every detail of my work history and personal life. I answered them as best I could, maintaining my composure despite the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. "Look, officers, I understand your concerns, but I can assure you that I've done nothing wrong," I pleaded, my voice tinged with frustration. "Karen has made a false accusation, and she's trying to ruin my reputation and my livelihood." The officers exchanged a glance, their faces inscrutable. "We understand your position, sir, but we have to take these allegations seriously," one of them said. "We've received several reports that you may have been involved in some shady business dealings in the past." I felt my heart sink. "That's simply not true," I insisted. "I've been a licensed contractor in this community for over a decade, and I've never had a single complaint or disciplinary action against me." The officers seemed unconvinced, their expressions hardening. "Well, the investigation is ongoing, and we'll need to verify your claims," the other officer said sternly. "In the meantime, we're going to have to hold you here for further questioning." I opened my mouth to protest, but the officers were already moving towards the door, effectively cutting off any further discussion. I sat there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. This was a nightmare, pure and simple, and I was powerless to stop it. As the minutes ticked by, I struggled to maintain my composure. I knew that the truth was on my side, but in the face of Karen's relentless campaign of misinformation and manipulation, it was becoming increasingly difficult to see a way out of this mess. One thing was certain: I couldn't give up. I had too much invested in my business, too much at stake to let Karen win. I was going to fight this, no matter what it took, and I had a feeling that the battle was only just beginning. As the hours ticked by in the stuffy interrogation room, I found myself growing increasingly frustrated and anxious. The police officers had grilled me relentlessly, poring over every detail of my past, searching for any hint of wrongdoing. And all the while, I knew that the real culprit was my neighbor, Karen, who had orchestrated this entire charade for her own twisted sense of satisfaction. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the room swung open, and a weary-looking detective stepped inside. He regarded me with a neutral expression, his arms folded across his chest. "We've reviewed the evidence, and it seems that your neighbor's allegations don't hold up," he said, his voice surprisingly even. "Your contractor's license checks out, and we haven't found any credible evidence of past misconduct on your part." I felt a surge of relief wash over me, but I knew better than to let my guard down. "So, what happens now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The detective sighed and shook his head. "Well, we're going to have to release you, of course. But I have to say, this whole situation is a mess. Your neighbor seems to have a history of making unfounded complaints and accusations against her neighbors." I nodded, feeling a mixture of vindication and dread. "So, what can I do about it?" I asked, my mind racing with possibilities. The detective shrugged. "Honestly, your best bet may be to try and reason with her directly. See if you can get her to back off and stop harassing you. If that doesn't work, you might want to consider taking legal action for defamation or harassment." I grimaced at the thought of having to deal with Karen again, but I knew I didn't have much of a choice. This woman had already put me through the ringer, and I couldn't let her get away with it. As the detective led me out of the station, I felt a heavy weight on my shoulders. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and the thought of having to confront Karen again filled me with dread. But I knew I had to do it, for the sake of my business, my reputation, and my sanity. When I arrived home, I found Karen standing in her driveway, a smug expression on her face. I took a deep breath and strode towards her, determined to put an end to this madness once and for all. "Karen, we need to talk," I said, my voice firm and unyielding. "What you did was completely unacceptable, and I won't stand for it any longer." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms defiantly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped. "I was just doing my civic duty and reporting suspicious activity in the neighborhood." I shook my head in disbelief. Suspicious activity. "Karen, I'm a licensed contractor, and I was simply repairing my own roof. Your false accusations have put me through hell, and I won't let you get away with it." For a moment, Karen seemed taken aback, her bravado faltering. But then, a sinister grin spread across her face, and I knew I was in for a fight. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I have plenty of other tricks up my sleeve, and I'm not going to stop until I get what I want." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that this was far from over. Karen was a formidable opponent, and she was clearly willing to go to any lengths to get her way. I knew that I had to be prepared for whatever she had in store, because this was a battle that I couldn't afford to lose. The tense confrontation with Karen had left me feeling uneasy and on edge. I knew that she wouldn't let this go easily, and I had to be prepared for whatever she had in store. As I replayed the events in my mind, I couldn't help but wonder what her next move would be. Later that evening, as I was finishing up some paperwork for my contracting business, my phone suddenly rang. Glancing at the caller ID, I felt my stomach knot up. It was Karen. "What do you want, Karen?" I asked, my voice terse. "Oh, I just wanted to let you know that I've decided to file a formal complaint with the local Contractors Association," she said, her tone dripping with feigned innocence. Apparently, they take these sorts of allegations very seriously. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Are you kidding me?" I exclaimed. "I've done nothing wrong, and you know it. This is just another one of your petty attempts to ruin my reputation and my livelihood." Karen's laughter on the other end of the line sent a chill down my spine. "Well, we'll see about that, won't we?" she purred. "After all, I have plenty of evidence to support my claims. And you know how these bureaucratic organizations can be. they tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to allegations of misconduct. I felt my blood boil as the realization dawned on me. Karen wasn't just trying to get me in trouble with the police. She was now going after my professional credentials, the very foundation of my business. Karen, I swear, if you go through with this, I'll sue you for defamation, I threatened, my voice shaking with anger. Oh, I'd love to see you try, Karen snorted. You know how the legal system works. It's all about who has the deeper pockets and the better connections. And let's just say, I have a few tricks up my sleeve in that department as well. With that, she hung up, leaving me to stew in my own frustration and fear. I knew that I had to act fast, but the thought of having to navigate the bureaucratic minefield of the Contractors Association filled me with dread. They were notoriously strict and unyielding, and I couldn't afford to have my license revoked, even temporarily. As I sat there, pondering my next move, a thought occurred to me. Maybe I wasn't the only one who had been on the receiving end of Karen's malicious behavior. Perhaps there were others in the neighborhood who had experienced similar issues with her. I quickly began reaching out to my fellow contractors, as well as any other neighbors I knew. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. It seemed that Karen had a long history of causing trouble, with a pattern of false accusations and petty feuds. Armed with this newfound information, I knew that I had to take a more proactive approach. I couldn't let Karen's lies and manipulations go unchallenged. Not this time. I was determined to fight back, to expose her for the vindictive and unstable person that she was. As I began to formulate a plan, a glimmer of hope started to emerge. Maybe, just maybe, I could turn the tables on Karen and finally put an end to her reign of terror. With a newfound sense of determination, I set out to gather as much evidence as possible against Karen's false accusations. I reached out to my fellow contractors, as well as any other neighbors who had experienced issues with her, and was met with an overwhelming response. It seemed that Karen had a long history of causing trouble in the neighborhood, with a pattern of making false complaints and harassing those she perceived as a threat. One neighbor recounted how she had reported him for illegally trimming a tree on his own property, while another described how she had filed a noise complaint against a family with young children simply for playing in their backyard. Armed with these stories, I knew I had to act quickly to get ahead of Karen's latest scheme. I decided to reach out to the local Contractors Association, determined to present a compelling case before she had a chance to do any real damage. As I sat across from the stern-faced members of the association, I laid out the facts of my case, my unblemished record as a licensed contractor, the details of Karen's false accusations, and the evidence of her pattern of harassment. I could see the skepticism in their eyes at first, but as I continued to speak, I could feel their attitudes start to shift. "This is a serious allegation, Mr. Johnson," one of the association members finally said, his brow furrowed. "We take any claims of misconduct very seriously, and will need to thoroughly investigate this matter." I nodded, bracing myself for the worst. "I understand, and I welcome the investigation," I replied, my voice steady. "I have nothing to hide, and I'm confident that the truth will come to light." As the meeting adjourned, I couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to see this through to the end. Karen had gone too far, and it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. In the days that followed, I continued to gather more evidence, reaching out to other members of the community and building a case that was impossible to ignore. I meticulously documented every interaction with Karen, every false accusation, and every instance of her harassment, leaving no stone unturned. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to sense that the tide was turning against her. She became increasingly erratic and aggressive, lashing out at me and my fellow neighbors with ever more outrageous claims. But I refused to be intimidated, standing firm in the knowledge that the truth was on my side. As the investigation by the Contractors Association dragged on, I found myself growing more and more anxious. The fate of my business hung in the balance, and I knew that a single misstep could undo everything I had worked so hard to build. But then, just when I was starting to lose hope, a glimmer of good news arrived. The association had completed their investigation, and they had reached a decisive conclusion. Karen's accusations were completely unfounded, and there was no evidence of any wrongdoing on my part. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I also knew that the battle was far from over. Karen was not the type to simply accept defeat, and I had a sinking feeling that she would be back, determined to find some other way to bring me down. As the news of the Contractors Association's decision spread through the neighborhood, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. After all the stress and anxiety that Karen had put me through, it was immensely satisfying to know that my reputation and professional credentials had been fully restored. But just as I was starting to breathe a sigh of relief, I received a call from the local police department. Apparently, Karen had not given up on her quest to take me down, and she had turned her attention to even more drastic measures. "Mr. Johnson, we've received a report that you've been threatening your neighbor, Karen," the officer on the other end of the line said, his voice stern. "She's claiming that you've been harassing her and making intimidating statements." I felt my blood boil. "That's completely false," I exclaimed, struggling to keep my composure. "Karen has been the one harassing me for weeks, and I've done nothing but defend myself against her false accusations." The officer seemed skeptical. "Be that as it may, we still need to investigate these allegations. I'm going to have to ask you to come down to the station for further questioning." Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing that I had no choice but to cooperate. As I made my way to the police station, my mind raced with a million different thoughts. How had Karen managed to turn the tables on me again? And what was her endgame? Once I arrived, the officers grilled me for hours, probing into every detail of my interactions with Karen. They seemed to take her claims of harassment seriously, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lead detective stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Johnson, we've reviewed the evidence, and it seems that there may be some truth to your neighbor's allegations," he said, his voice flat. I felt my heart sink. "But that's impossible," I protested. "I've done nothing wrong, and the Contractors Association has already cleared me of any wrongdoing." The detective held up a hand, silencing me. "Be that as it may, we still have to take these claims seriously. We're going to have to issue a restraining order against you, prohibiting you from contacting or approaching Karen." I stared at him in disbelief, my mind reeling. "A restraining order?" I exclaimed. "This is absurd. Karen is the one who's been harassing me, and you're going to punish me for it." The detective shook his head, his expression sympathetic. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Johnson, but the law is the law. If you violate the terms of the restraining order, you could face serious legal consequences." As the officers escorted me out of the station, I felt a sense of overwhelming defeat. Karen had managed to turn the tables on me once again, using the legal system as a weapon to silence me and ruin my reputation. I knew then that I had to find a way to fight back, to expose Karen's lies and manipulation for what they really were. This was no longer just about my business, it was about my very freedom, and I was determined to do whatever it took to come out on top. As the days passed, the weight of the restraining order against me felt like a heavy burden, constantly weighing on my mind. I knew that I couldn't let Karen's latest scheme go unchallenged, but the thought of violating the order and facing even more legal consequences was a terrifying prospect. Determined to find a way to fight back, I began reaching out to local community leaders, civil rights organizations, and anyone else who might be willing to listen to my story. I needed to find a way to expose Karen's manipulation and clear my name once and for all. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. It seemed that Karen's reputation for causing trouble had spread far and wide, and many in the community were eager to lend their support. Neighbors came forward with their own stories of her harassment, and local officials expressed outrage at the way the justice system had been twisted to serve her twisted agenda. Armed with this groundswell of support, I decided to take my case to the media. I reached out to local news outlets, pitching my story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of holding those in authority accountable. The response was swift and significant. Within days, my story had become a local sensation, with reporters clamoring to get the scoop on the Karen from hell who had terrorized an entire neighborhood. The local police department, faced with the glare of public scrutiny, quickly backtracked on a decision to issue the restraining order, acknowledging that they had been too quick to believe Karen's lies. But the real victory came when the Contractors Association, under intense pressure from the community, decided to take a closer look at Karen's claims. After a thorough investigation, they not only reaffirmed their original decision to clear me of any wrongdoing, but they also took the unprecedented step of revoking Karen's own contractor's license, citing a long history of unethical behavior and misrepresentation. As the news spread through the neighborhood, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication and relief. Karen's reign of terror had finally come to an end, and the community had come together to stand up against her blatant abuse of power. But even as I reveled in my triumph, I couldn't help but feel a tinge of sadness. This whole ordeal had taken a heavy emotional toll, and I knew that the scars would take time to heal. Still, I was grateful to have the support of my neighbors and the knowledge that I had done the right thing, no matter the cost. As I looked out over the neighborhood, I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of hope. This experience had shown me the power of community, the importance of standing up for one's principles, and the ultimate triumph of truth over lies. And I knew that, no matter what the future held, I would be ready to face it head-on, with the knowledge that I had the strength and support of those around me.